G'day brothers and sisters. Today we're looking at the parable of the Good Samaritan. The parable of the Good Samaritan is an amazing parable. It's so simplistic, but its meaning is so powerful and its application is so powerful. But one thing we must remember about Jesus' parables is they're like a cake. You can actually cut into them, and they are a beautiful crafting together of different layers in order to communicate one central point. And the parable of the Good Samaritan, although it's a very obvious parable in its meaning, many Christians fail to actually cut into it to actually capture the full weight and the full gravity of what Jesus is saying. The first thing we've got to understand is we titled this parable, the parable of the Good Samaritan. But that's not how Jesus' audience would have understood the Samaritans. The Jews hated the Samaritans. There was enmity between the Jews and the Samaritans, and there had been this enmity and this rivalry for centuries. Several hundred years before the time of Christ, there was a terrible civil war or a splitting between the nation of Israel, between the north and the south, and there was hostility. And the northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes, broke off from the 2 southern tribes and formed their own kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. And the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah then became enemies, and instead of being one unified people, they were separated. And the tribes in the north set up a new capital. The kings in the north set up a new capital in Samaria, which is why they were called Samaritans. And there's a whole deep history. There's a history of intermarriage with Gentiles, which made for great political and great religious and economic hostility. And there were cases of the Jews actually burning down the Samaritan rival temple, which had been set up on Mount Gerizim. There had been examples about Jews and Samaritans trying to avoid each other's villages. And when they had gone in, there were cases of them being beaten up. There were cases of the Samaritans scattering dead bodies, the bones of dead corpses, onto in the Jewish temple. So there was great economic and political and religious hostility between these two groups. So when Jesus tells a story about a Samaritan who loved his neighbor, the Jewish audience would have thought that this was strange and bizarre. They hated the Samaritans. The Samaritans were a curse word to them, like the equivalent of the N-word. There was real hostility between these two groups. And we've got to remember that prior to Jesus telling this parable, he himself had been rejected by a number of Samaritan villages. There was at least one Samaritan village which had received him. You can read about that in John chapter 4. But there were many who had rejected him. And Jesus had also been rejected by many of the Jewish villages. Prior to the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus says, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago." So the vast majority of people by this stage, whether they were Jewish or Samaritan, had rejected Jesus. And then if we read the story, it sets up this parable very nicely. It says, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, this is normally how teaching sessions would go in Jesus' day. A rabbi would sit amongst his disciples and teach them, and you would only stand up to ask a question or to make a formal challenge. So most likely, this teacher, he was a scribe or a lawyer, stands up to challenge Jesus, to actually challenge him and to have Jesus pronounce his legal verdict. And the teacher asks him, the lawyer asks him, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus replies and says, "How do you read it?" In other words, Jesus says, "You're a lawyer, you're a scribe, you're educated in the law, you answer that question." Now, this is not Jesus trying to dodge the question. We've got to remember, in Jesus' day, rabbis would ask questions of students in order to answer questions. It was an important teaching device. So the teacher of the law says, I know in Deuteronomy chapter 6, it says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind." So Jesus says, yeah, very good. That's what Deuteronomy says. Love the Lord your God. It's the great commandment. And then he goes on to say, and there's also something in Leviticus 19 which says, "Love your neighbor as yourself." And in the context of Leviticus 19, your neighbor in that passage referred primarily to Israelite neighbors, but also to foreigners who were living amongst you in your communities. And Jesus says, good job, you've answered correctly. But the lawyer, notice, wants to justify himself. The lawyers and the scribes in this day and age and the teachers would argue back and forth about what it meant to love their neighbors. Who was their neighbors? They would argue. Who were their neighbors? They would argue. They would also argue what exactly you had to do to inherit eternal life. So this lawyer doesn't want to seem foolish in Jesus' eyes. He doesn't want to seem foolish in the crowd's eyes because he doesn't want to say, look, the answer's so simple. Why did I bother to ask it in the first place? So he seeks to justify himself. He seeks to find a legal loophole which the scribes had been debating. Who are our neighbors? And it's to this question that Jesus responds with the parable of the Good Samaritan. And let's cut into this cake a little bit. Jesus says, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now, the distance between Jericho and Jerusalem was about 30 kilometers. The road was a winding road. Jerusalem is above sea level, whereas Jericho is the lowest inhabited city on earth. It is 240 meters below sea level. So the trip from Jerusalem down to Jericho took place on this winding downward slope. You would go through ravines and valleys, and there were a lot of caves and secluded areas where people could hide themselves. It was a notorious zone for criminals and for criminal activity. Many people would have been beaten and robbed on this pathway. In fact, there is a section of this road between Jericho and Jerusalem called the Valley of the Shadow of Death. And David, when he's writing Psalm 23, and he says, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, he uses this region of this winding road between Jericho and Jerusalem as a metaphor for death itself. So many merchants would have been robbed on this passageway. The fact that this man was traveling alone suggests that he was most likely a poor merchant, because more wealthier merchants would travel in groups in order to protect themselves from bandits and robbers. And this is how Jesus frames the story. He uses a road that everybody would have been familiar with. And he says that they stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. Now, there were many priests who lived in Jericho because it was so close to Jerusalem, and the priestly divisions would be divided up, and they would serve a couple of times a year in the temple. And this would have been a common road that priests would have been traveling down, having completed their service in Jerusalem. And there are many people who have argued that the reason why the priest wouldn't have wanted to touch the dead body was because under the Jewish law, if you touched a dead body, that was regarded as touching something which was unclean, and you would be ceremonially unclean for 7 days, which meant you couldn't perform any religious duties. But notice the man is going the same way, which means that he has already completed his time of service in the temple. So he could have touched the dead body, even though it would have meant being ceremonially unclean for 7 days. But yet he doesn't help this man who had been beaten. And most likely, although Jesus doesn't give us any indication as to the ethnicity of the man who had been attacked, we can assume that it was a Jew. So this priest doesn't help his fellow Jew. And then it goes on to say, so to a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed on by the other side. Now the Levites were responsible for administering the welfare system in Jesus' day amongst the Jewish people. They were given funds and resources to help people who were in need. And yet, this Levite ignores the basic task of his duty to help somebody who's in need. And then the story goes, but as a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. The Greek word that Jesus actually is described as using here conveys that this man's heart was broken to the point of tears at seeing the way that this man had been beaten and badly treated. So it says that he bandaged his wounds, pouring oil and wine. Oil and wine were used for medicinal purposes in Jesus' day. And it says that he places him on his donkey and took him to an inn to take care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. 2 denarii would have been around the equivalent of 2 days' worth of wages for a laborer. So that's what this man is doing. Now remember, this man is also traveling alone, so it's possible that he is also Paul, given the fact that he is traveling alone, just like the original man who was beaten was. And it says, look after him, he said, and I will return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. So Jesus, having told the story of the Good Samaritan, concludes his teaching component by asking the original questioner, who was the real neighbor to this man? Now the answer to you and I is obvious. The answer is, well, of course, the Samaritan was the real neighbor. But this wouldn't have been so obvious to all of Jesus' hearers. Because the Jews hated the Samaritans, many of them would have thought, no, the Samaritan is definitely not the hero of this story. They would have said, oh no, it was probably the religious teacher, because the religious teacher, he was certain not to discharge or compromise his duties to God by accidentally coming in contact with potentially a dead body. So many people would have done everything in their power to try to make it out that the Samaritan wasn't the real hero of this story. But this lawyer, this expert, doesn't do that. He's honest. He says it's the Samaritan. And it's this response that helps us to understand how Jesus flips the script. In Jesus' mind, the question is not, who is my neighbor? The question is, who am I being a neighbor to? Am I being a neighbor to even the people who I revile, even the people who I am at war with and the people who I don't like? Remember, for centuries there had been this enmity between the Jews and the Samaritans. And here Jesus is commanding his audience to love even those people who you are at enmity with, even those people who you regard as dogs, even those people who you hate. So this is not only challenging our prejudices, it's actually challenging our very heart. We need to not only love the Lord our God with all of our heart, with all of our soul, with all of our mind and our strength, but this love for God manifests in an unprejudiced love for all people. Now, I want to just close by saying that Jesus' words are elevated if we understand the Old Testament background to this. You see, there are many elements of this story that come out in an episode which happened and which is described in 2 Chronicles chapter 28. Now, I mentioned earlier that when there was this breaking off, when there was this civil war between the north and the south tribes, and there had been this separation and this enmity had formed as a result of them, there was a particular episode where there had actually been a case of a skirmish, a battle between the northern and the southern tribes. And 2 Chronicles 28 describes the outcome of this. The southern tribes lose this particular skirmish to the northern tribes because they are being led by a wicked king whose name is Ahaz. And at the end of this skirmish, the northern tribes seek to take some of the southern prisoners as prisoners of war and as war booty and treasure. And it says that when they inquire of God as to what they should do, God prevents them from actually doing this. He says to them, these are actually your fellow Israelites in my eyes. In my eyes, God says there is no separation. That's something that you guys have done. But in my eyes, you are one people. And he commands them, he says, listen to this. It says, so the soldiers, after God had commissioned them not to mistreat these prisoners of war, he says, so the soldiers gave up the prisoners and plunder in the presence of the officials and all the assembly. The men designated by name took the prisoners from the plunder. They clothed all who were naked. Remember, in this story, the man is left naked. It says they provided them with clothes and sandals, food and drink, and healing balm. Doesn't this sound very similar to what the Good Samaritan does? He provides medicinal healing balm for the man that had been beaten. All those who were there, who were weak, they put on donkeys. All those who were weak, they put on donkeys. That's very much like what the Samaritan does. So they took them back to their fellow Israelites at Jericho, the city of palms, and returned to Samaria. The full impact of the parable of the Good Samaritan can only be understood when we understand this Old Testament story. There was a very same historical event where God had commanded the Samaritans to look after the Israelites and to bandage their wounds and to send them back to Jericho. That's why Jesus uses the very story of Jericho in this particular parable. So the ultimate understanding of this story for us is to realize that we as followers of God are to show no prejudice to anybody. We are to love everybody. We are not to discriminate on people because of their ethnicity, because of their gender, or because of their political beliefs, or nothing. We need to love our neighbors just like God commanded these ancient Samaritans to love their neighbors. God bless you, brothers and sisters, and we'll see you next time.